In 1883, the New York Globe carried a story from Richmond, Virginia about a group of whites acquitted following a racially motivated street brawl in Danville that left 4 black men dead. A colored man is mercilessly beaten by a white man, while another brandishes a revolver to keep off all peacemakers, the Globe reported. These are the class of men that the Danville jury would exonerate. Further into the article about news from the Old Dominion was a brief report about the arrival of a new black-owned newspaper, the Richmond Planet. The Planet assured that for decades to come, the struggle for racial justice would not just be chronicled by a newspaper from New York, but one right from Richmond, Virginia.
Richmond being the so-called capital of the Confederacy, you still had free reign to hear what was coming out of the Confederates' mouth. So the way that they were painting the past, and in some ways still painting the past, you could actually use a newspaper to correct.
The Richmond Planet first came off the presses when Reconstruction was ending, but Jim Crow was beginning. A front-page article in the farewell edition of the Planet traced the newspaper's weekly origins to a meeting of 13 formerly enslaved men who gathered in a room above a bookstore at 3rd and Broad Street. The newspaper they launched played a crucial role in molding the opinions of Negroes in this city, state, and nation, as written in a Richmond Planet article under a headline noting the publication was "Born in the Wake of Freedom." From the 1880s until the 1930s, the Planet bore witness during a time when mob rule and the Ku Klux Klan's campaign of violence and intimidation against African Americans reached new heights. The Planet offered a new voice for justice in the Old South, speaking truth to power as white politicians passed laws to deny African Americans their rights to vote, to sit where they wanted in Richmond streetcars, and to live where they pleased. As white-run newspapers celebrated the arrival of Confederate statues that loomed over Richmond's Monument Avenue, the Richmond Planet warned in an editorial that the glorification of states' rights and honoring the people who supported it will ultimately result in the handing down to generations unborn a legacy of treason and blood. The headlines and stories about brutality, racism, and injustice published in the Planet are from another century, but they remain very familiar today.
I could only imagine what it was like to have a newspaper led by African-American men in the 1800s when there was lynchings that were still happening in Virginia. So at any point in time, if they were caught by themselves, who knows what happened or who knows what they experienced. Print was power. So if you had a newspaper, you controlled the narrative, you controlled who that narrative was disseminated to. So there was an African-American paper that told all stories.
During their careers, the newspaper's founders went on to become lawyers, building businesses to promote self-sufficiency, and educating the city's African-American children to unlock a more promising future. Many of the men who launched the Planet were teachers, just like Albert V. Narl, a longtime Richmond school educator and Richmond Planet co-founder who would have 20 descendants follow in his footsteps and serve in Richmond public schools.
Well, you know, we're just coming out of enslavement and radical Reconstruction, which really only lasted about 12 years. For the majority of the people that came out of slavery, they were uneducated, illiterate. But my grandfather was enrolled at the Manley School at 16. So I think a lot of the people that joined together to start the Planet were contemporaries of him because they were educated, they were literate, they understood the need to educate more. And what better way than through a newspaper?
He knew what it was like to be a slave. He was not going to let the community that he was now living in be considered to be inferior or second-class citizens.
Looking back now, I realized what a community activist he was, how he was so forceful in making sure that Black people in general as a race pooled their resources, came together. They were determined not to let Jim Crow, segregation, intimidation by the KKK deter them in their effort to better themselves and their community.